Hey
Cool.
guys, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Manny, and welcome to another live session. And for this one, we have a spectacular environment artist. I'm going to call him an environment master, um, Clinton Crumpler, who's going to be giving us an overview of his workflow and pipeline. And as I mentioned, also talk to us about his upcoming course, Modular Environment Design in Unreal 4. So I'm just going to shut up and let Clinton take it away.
Sure. Yeah, I guess let me start by, kind of giving a little bit of background of how I started and kind of where I came from. Let's see. So I started out, I went to school at Longwood University. I went for graphic design there. And then after that, I liked graphic design, but I wanted to get into some 3D stuff. So I decided to go back to school for my master's at SCAD, or Savannah College of Art and Design, down in Savannah, Georgia. I went there for 4 years for my master's and got my master's in game art. And then from there, I went to Alabama for a little bit. I worked at the Army Game Studio. That was pretty cool, having security clearance and working with the Army. That was pretty nice for a little bit.
Right on.
That's pretty fun. And then I took a lot of freelance contracts and just like stuff to learn as much as I could. And then eventually I moved to San Francisco, where I worked at Kixeye for a bit. And I got to work in the beta for Unreal before it came out. That was pretty fun. I worked with a few good people there, really talented artists there. And then a few more contracts, worked with Digital Tutors for a little bit, did some sessions for them. And then just so on and so forth. And now I'm working at the Coalition. I'm working on Gears of War 4 right now. And I'm just working on some new content for that.
Thank you so much for kind of just giving us a little bit about background about yourself. So so talk to us about your workflow, just a general overview of how you work, starting from the beginning to what we see here.
Sure.
What does that look like?
Yeah, definitely. So when I start out, I typically I'm really big into reference gathering. So like I use a lot of Pinterest, which is like, some people are like, oh, that's kind of goofy. It's like for wedding photos and stuff, but like I love it. There's so many cool things you can do with Pinterest. And like I definitely like, for like the laundromat scene I did, I just went through and I just like basically collected as much reference as I possibly could. Anything that ranges from like just a feel or mood or lighting or just a sensation you get from looking at an image. And I feel like that's really important to kind of establishing like the base ground of what you're trying to establish, just to convey to like the viewer. And then as I move forward, I just start kind of blocking out some shapes, just kind of getting an idea of really what I want to see with my just like the overall compositions. I'll usually put a few cameras in, get the FOV kind of down to where I like it, and then start throwing in a few point lights just to see the kind of mood that I'm trying to kind of achieve. And I feel like that's really important too, to like really get the idea before you even start making content, because I feel like too often when I first started in the industry, I would just like, oh, I'm going to make this one asset and then I'm going to make a whole scene around it. And then it's like, you'll just like hit the ground running and you won't even realize it before you've like made these kind of really obscure objects that don't really fit together or really have like a cohesive thought. And so definitely try to like make sure I kind of have like either in my general mood down, my general color palette down, and then a bunch of reference before I start. And then after the blockout stage, I'll start throwing on a few like tiling textures. I'll kind of do it like build it up base by base. And then I also create my master material. And I really like materials. I really like working with materials, especially in Unreal, where it's a visual-based node system. I find that one of the easiest things to work with, and even if you don't know any kind of code or programming and stuff like that, just working in the Unreal material editor, you can quickly like throw a few things together and get a lot of cool stuff without too much like overhead. And I find that's what I like working in Unreal the most about, is that you kind of you can hit the ground running in this without having to worry about a lot of the technical limitations that you might have otherwise, or meet in nodes like programming or code. And then moving from there, I'll typically start making a prop sheet. And I actually use another online application called Trello. And Trello is just basically, it's a series of boards that you put together that just basically says like, or I want these many assets, and then I put it in a column, and I say, these are all the assets I'm going to make. These are all my primary assets. These are all my secondary assets. And then as I go through the process, I move them from like textured or modeled or finished, and then that way, as you're self-managing yourself for doing anything on your own, it's kind of easier to be like, oh, where did I leave off on this one asset, or did I finish that one thing I kind of set out to do originally, and then from there I just kind of keep going through that Trello board and I just kind of work through the scene, and as I go through I do a lot of test lighting. I'll do some bake lighting just to test to make sure things I placed are still holding up to the composition I originally intended. I'll still test like different post effects and things like that, just to make sure it's still looking good all throughout the process. And then towards the end is when I start working on the aspect that's like the lookup tables and things like that. And I'll start working on just my general post process and getting that down, and then working on a lot of just color palettes. And to do with that, I actually did an article a couple months back with 80 Level, and just talk about how you can kind of get color palettes. And I feel like that's actually one of the most overlooked and important parts of getting a scene like this kind of down to where you want it. And then here's some of just the things I talked about, where you basically just it's more of a squint view of looking at an image, and then kind of looking at it and being like, oh, these are the kind of colors and composition I'm trying to get. And then you can see all these different images that are really moody and that kind of have a really cool atmosphere to them always have a kind of color palette that you're trying to grasp. And so by the end of the project, working on the laundromat, I got to a point where down here you can see without the post processing, it's
they're
kind
saying
of simple.
Scroll a little slower.
Oh, sorry about that.
No
So right here you can see without post processing, it's a little blander. It's not as exciting or moody, but I got the kind of balance of lighting that I was trying to get. And then from there, with just a bit of post processing tweaks, you get to a much more kind of extensive use of your lighting and darks, and kind of putting purples in your shadows or blues in your shadows, and then some pinks in your highlights, things of that nature. And then
could we get the? I'm sorry, Clint. Could we get the URL? The guys are asking for the
sure,
URL.
Yeah.
You can just copy and paste that into the chat.
Yeah, sure. There you go.
Great.
Yeah, and I have this this write up and a bit more on my website as well too, which is just ClintonCrumpler.com, and that's in my resources page, so you can always look at that as well too. It's got a bit more of the material breakdowns and just some of the how I broke down the shots and things like that. And then, so from there, after I kind of get the post process down, I just tweak a few more things just to make sure everything's within. I do some spot testing to make sure the light is baking properly, and then I bake my lighting, and that's pretty much it. Cool.
You make it sound so easy.
There's 80 to 800 odd hours in there somewhere.
Exactly. Summed up in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So cool. We obviously have a set of questions that a lot of the viewers have asked beforehand, but I'm going to go through some of the ones that they had as it relates to what you were just talking about. What's the FPS on the scene?
The FPS on this scene is relatively high. I think it's somewhere between I think we're keeping it somewhere between 35 and 40, just for quick tests without LODs, without doing any extreme cleanup, just because it was more of this was supposed to be more of a tech demo. And so it was more of just we need to put a character in here. We need to have them walk around. We need to be able to film it without it kind of locking up. So it was more of because it was more of a tech demo, I got to get a little bit more liberal with texture sizes and resolution on rocks, or just general poly counts. Whereas, if this was going to be for game, I would definitely come back through and do a pass where I would do a lot of LODing and make sure, okay, maybe this 2048 texture doesn't need to be 2048. Maybe I can downsize it to 1024 and then find a way to kind of save some space and just remove some polys in places that there's not necessary. So I think depending on the project, you just kind of have to keep that in mind to kind of get that target frame rate. Cool.
And guys, I know you have a lot of questions here, but as I said, we're going to kind of go through some of the questions that we got from a lot of you guys who signed in and kind of filled out that survey, and we'll kind of just jump around a little bit. So what type of artistic freedom do you have when working in production?
Production, I think it just depends. It really depends on the studio and kind of what your role consists of. I find that depending on most studios, when you go in, they're pretty open to they're hiring you for your artistic content and ability. And so most of the studios I've worked at, I've been really lucky to be able to kind of go in and like, I might not have necessarily at the beginning been like, oh, I'm the material guy. But as I kind of work and there's like a situation or a problem that kind of occurs where it's like, oh, there's this issue with this thing. If I kind of volunteer to tackle it, or if you're like wanting to tackle something, most people are like, oh, sure. If you know that kind of stuff, or you want to give that a shot, you know, we're more than happy to let you like kind of like figure it out and go through the problem. And I feel like that's where you do a lot of your learning, because when you get into a studio, you might think, oh, I'm just a prop artist. But as you grow as an artist and as you work at those studios, you'll find that, oh, there's this thing I need to do that's slightly different than what I'm doing typically. And so you'll start to like grow in these like different avenues of like just abilities that you didn't really know that you were like interested in, and you kind of grow to learn different like aspects of the engine and like just development in general.
Cool. And so when you're working, you know, when you're working on a scene like this, well, as I said, actually before that, when you decided, okay, this is what I want to work on, what inspires you? Like, what's that process? I mean, for the laundromat, where you're in a laundromat one night and you're like, you know what, this would be a cool scene to model.
Yeah, it's really just like my favorite thing is like taking kind of mundane things that you see all around you and just like finding a way to transfer them into something that's much more moody and kind of has like an emotional response from it. I really try to look at like a lot of traditional painters and sculptors. I spend a lot of time on, like I said, on Pinterest. I spend a lot of time on Polycount looking at other artists' stuff, and I just kind of like feel that when you see something in like anywhere, like I'll just like see like something and I'm walking around, I'll take a quick picture of it. And even if you don't like necessarily take that one idea and elaborate on later, when you start collecting those just general thoughts, it just kind of inspires you throughout any kind of creative process. So when you sit down, like say 3 months from now, and you're like, oh, I've really been wanting to work on a scene, I'm just not sure what to work on. You kind of look through your phone or whatever you've been taking photos on, or like wherever you kind of been saving resources, and you just kind of like glance through it all of a sudden, you know, all the creativity starts sparking in your head. So like where you would normally have some like, you know, artist block, you just like all of a sudden because you've just been leading up to this point and using that kind of off time just casually to like build up your thoughts, you become so much more inspired when you want to start working on something. So I think just kind of like always thinking as an artist, but only like, you know, spending the time and like kind of like making a concise idea when you're ready to work is like kind of the big things for inspiration.
Cool. And when you're creating an environment, where do you like? What's the first thing? Are you you know, are you blocking in a model? Are you even sketching? You know, your own design? Like, you know, when you're working on this scene, where you just jump into ZBrush and start, you know, kind of just finding the shapes and really exploring, or are you doing designs?
For sure, yeah. I think when I first start a project, I'll definitely like just like literally make cubes. I don't want any other shapes. I don't want to spend too much time. I just want to like throw some cubes into a scene, kind of get some ideas. Sometimes I'll just like literally take a screenshot of what I've made with the cubes, and then I'll do a print screen, and then I'll like print it out, or like I'll just like draw on top of it with a tablet just to like sketch some ideas. And I feel like that's where you can save the most time and also get the most creative, because you don't waste so much time like making a whole asset from start to finish without knowing what the whole scene's going to be. And so like by doing that, you kind of just like get some ideas quickly down on paper. You get some ideas that you're like, oh, this is not going to look good, or this composition isn't that inspiring, and you can kind of work through like the ideas that you don't like so you can get to the ideas that you do.
Great. I think that's a smart way of working. So do you use BS for your blocking?
BSPs, yeah, I definitely do. When I first started in Unreal, I was working in UDK, and so there was a lot more BSPs when using that. And then as I switched to UE4, I feel like I probably go about, whereas before I was probably about half and half, I'm maybe about 25% BSP to about like 75% just quick block models. Just because like using FBXs and things like that for Unreal, it's just so quick nowadays, where you can just like throw a quick shape together in Maya, model it out real quick, throw it in the engine, test for scale. And like a lot of the measuring tools in Unreal have gotten better as well as in Maya. So like using that, I can kind of like gauge my shapes, gauge my dimensions, and then throw it in the engine and just hit the ground running after that.
Cool. And the mud scene, is that Vertex painted? Could you kind of zoom in on that a little bit?
Yeah. So yeah, these guys are all Vertex
Oh
painted.
my God.
So it's a couple of mixture of things. So like there's a rocky texture. There's a kind of texture where some footprints, kind of like where the soldiers or people have like trekked through here. There's a kind of like muddy kind of texture in here, and then
Beautiful.
these guys are actually splines that I have a alpha on, and then I'm using the new Unreal added a dither alpha transparency, and I've been using that to work with that to kind of like blend it into the scene a bit better.
Cool. I mean, this is spectacular, man. Yeah, you answered one of the questions, which is, do you use any spline, modeling for any of that? So it's great.
Yeah,
It's
yeah. There's
amazing.
tons of splines in here. I use splines for the extension cords. I use splines for all the overhead stuff. I use splines for all these tubes that go throughout the tunnels. Splines are super nice because you can like really quickly like lay down an idea. You don't have to spend too much time because you just make the one model, throw it on a spline, and then just like place it where you want, and you get a really quick idea of your composition. And also, it's perfect for like leading lines, which is like basically most of this tunnel is just like leading lines. It's just like getting you to look in a certain direction or like aiming you to a certain way.
Yeah. And for something like this, how long did it take you to create the scene?
Yeah, so the first time I worked on it for Clyde Entertainment, and it took about 2.5 months, maybe closer to 3, just for cleanup and things like that. I got another chance to work on it after we did the project together, and I took about another maybe 2 to 3 weeks to kind of just like do some cleanup work and refresh some of the textures. It had been about a year since I touched it, so obviously you learn a lot more as an artist, like every month. So I kind of came back and just kind of used the new knowledge that I had about new materials and new ways to go about doing the tiling textures on the walls and caves and things like that.
Cool. This is more of a compliment. Simon is saying, Clinton, if we're in the medieval ages, they would have burned you. You were a magician. So
That's awesome.
that's pretty cool. Is the spline tire tracks mesh or decal?
It is there's a combination of both. So I made a decal. I can actually show you up here. There's this decal right here that you can see I can lift up. And it's that guy. And then there's also the spline here. I can show you that. Let me open up the spline here. It's a spline like this. So I can move him. I can kind of twist him how I want him, depending on your kind of rotation and things like that. And so you can see it's got like that kind of dithered, really kind of transparent look. So that it kind of blends pretty well with the ground below it without you being able to tell the kind of transition between the two.
Cool. Asset. It's something else, man. The level of detail in that environment. It's just, yeah, great job. So floor and walls are the same. Andres is asking, are the floors and walls the same object? If not, how do you avoid the visible cross between them? Another one of our questions that we had further down, but let's tackle it now then.
Yes. Okay. So say one more time, just to make sure I understand the
question.
So
he's asking whether the floors and walls are the same objects. If not, how do you avoid the visible cross between them? I'm assuming.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So floors and walls are separate. I typically, when I do something like this, I kind of just think about the kind of color palette I'm using between the two. For this guy, I used a Vertex paint to blend between the two. So I ended up taking the kind of like basic dirt texture that I was using here, and then I Vertex painted it up the wall. And then I also did a blend down so that you can see like here, you can see where like the dirt is kind of falling in the cracks and like laid down on the wall. I do it based on direction. So like, I'm sure you've seen sometimes where they do like with snow or things like that, where it comes directionality wise. And so I did that. And then also I made this kind of mesh. It's a pretty simple mesh, and it's kind of just a group of rocks. And to use this kind of helps blend that transition between the two. Let me get it out of this light. So you can see if I turn it on lid here, it's just kind of a collection of rocks. And when I do that, I can kind of just shove it in the ground, put it against the wall, and all of a sudden you have like a nice transition between two surfaces. And I kept this kind of low poly just because I didn't want it to get too expensive to use this. And so I can use it pretty regularly without having to like worry about, oh, is this going to be cost efficient or not, because it's pretty low poly in general. And then just using the same materials that I'm using on the wall and the ground, it just kind of blends the two pretty seamlessly.
Cool. Rainey is asking for a wireframe, please.
Oh yeah, sure. Let's see. Let me throw this guy back in here and give you a wireframe. So you can see the ground is not too dense. The walls are a little bit more dense because they have a bit more shape to them. And you can see too, if I pull out here, it's just a bunch of these intersecting pieces. I made a set of about 3 or 4 that I could just basically take and just ram into each other without having to worry about is it gonna like do anything weird or is it gonna like penetrate with each other? Just because I wanted to make sure it blended pretty well. And you can see here, I can switch back to unlit mode. It's just pretty much a piece like that. And then I just vertex paint the like the drips and grime and then the rest of it as well too.
Cool. So how do you, Alex is asking, how do you deal with bad lighting maps?
Bad lighting maps in what respect? I guess like sort of like when you're dealing with baking between 2 surfaces, or I guess that would be more of the scenario in this kind of case. With these guys, dealing with like light maps, you just kind of have to test your resolutions on your objects. Typically, I'll bring it into a scene where it's just basically a flat ground, and then I'll kind of put the pieces together, do a quick test bake, because I found when I first started, I was just like testing in the scene constantly, and it was like wasting a lot of time because like it takes so long to bake when it's all in together. So I would like go to a test scene, I do a few test bakes, and then I kind of like problem solve there. Also, I really like Unreal's automatic UV mapper for light maps. It cuts down so much time. Back when like on UDK you didn't have any of that, so you could like do so much quicker work with just like throwing in a mesh. It's already got light map. Usually in Maya I'll do a quick automatic unwrap for the second light map and then bring it in and it'll clean up everything else.
Cool. And is there any chance we could see the material setup for that?
Sure. Which one? The walls?
Yeah, let's see it for the walls.
Sure. Yeah, let's bring that up. Bring up details here. So this guy in particular is an instance, and so I'm going to open up his master here. And see, it's pretty simple. It's not too crazy. There's a few nodes that I made, functions that I made myself. So like you can see that it looks pretty clean here, but you can kind of go deeper down into the rabbit hole with some of these guys with like, say for instance, like I made this function so that basically I can use the dirt on the walls, on the props, and also on the ground without having to like make a new material every time. So if I double click this guy, this is my setup for every time I want to use this dirt. I don't have to do anything else. It's already set up. It's just got an output, and then I'm done. It's already set up. And then all I do is bring it in, throw in a few controls, and then ramp it into the other material and use this as a vertex blend. And it's always going to be consistent because it's always using the same function. And that also makes it easier for like editing later. Like, oh, I don't like this dirt. I kind of want it to be more red. So I just edit it one time, and then it does it across the board. I don't have to go back and do it to all of them.
Cool. Great stuff. All right. So Patrick is asking, when you start surfacing a scene, do you focus on tileable textures first and then work on unique assets after?
When I first started, I would say I would typically do like just quick to block meshes, and then I would do the tileables. But as I'm going forward, I'm finding that it's good to do some testing with your neural maps and your ambient occlusion first, just to kind of make sure you have everything where you want it. So typically I'll start making my tileables. If I make them in Maya or in Photoshop, I'll make my tileables. I'll just pump out a normal and an ambient occlusion map. And pretty much all the scenes I do, I use what's called an RMA map. So I just channel pack my roughness, my metallic, and my ambient occlusion. So I'll quickly just bring in like if it's a metal object, I'll just make it white really quick for metal. If it's not, I'll just make it black, and then I'll have my ambient occlusion. So I can basically throw everything in the level, have my normal, my ambient occlusion, and my metalness, and be like, okay, this is how it's going to look basically with just like pure lighting. And I can kind of test that with just like a white fill color on it with the neural map. And then from there, I can also start to see like you were saying before, with lighting issues right away, or like any kind of issues with like something doesn't look bright in the composition, or something really just like stands out. And that's before I've even added color. So that allows me to have a bit more control before I even really start working on the other parts of the project.
Cool. So Alex is saying, sorry for the silly question. How could you do such high quality vertex painting? Is that in Unreal? Yeah,
this is all in Unreal. So all the vertex painting is in Unreal. It's a bit harder to test, like say in Maya with vertex painting. So like everything I'm doing with vertex painting, unless it's something like kind of more just black and white, I'll always do it Unreal. And you can see it's like super simple to just like grab a brush And like, say if I'm going to use like blue channel on something, you can see it's pretty quick to throw that on there without too much hassle. And then as long as you kind of just keep an eye on the seams when you bake, you barely would see anything. So it just depends on how you're kind of like putting those surfaces together and kind of like baking it out.
Cool. So Nick is asking, what was the hardest part of the scene for you to create?
Sure. Yeah, I would say the hardest part was getting the rock walls to kind of look where I wanted. I tried a few things at first. I ended up kind of coming to like a sort of in between, where I made a switch that basically would allow me to for a higher quality scene. So say for instance, I wasn't concerned about the technical limitations of the scene. It was more for like a cinematic view or for like a tech demo. I ended up constructing a material that was basically like it would tile in world space, and it would be scaled to world space. So no matter how big you made the rock or how small you made the rock, the details would be the exact same size. And then also it would tile across all the seams, so that it would be the same texture tiled across all the main surfaces, and that would be my micro detail. And then each rock's like panel would have its own normal as well. That would be its sort of like macro normal. And so blending those together, I kind of like made the transition, and that took me a while to kind of like figure out the math about that. And then, like I said, I added the switch so that basically, if you were playing it in game, you would turn off that kind of like extra world space stuff, so that it would be a lot cheaper to render just for a character walking through it, like playing it, like shooting like people or doing whatever kind of through the scene.
Great. Alex is asking, how do you deal with texture sample limits in Material Editor?
Sure, yeah. So with texture samples, typically you're constricted to 16, and that's including the landscape material. There's a few ways around it that I've read online, but I typically don't want to push it more farther than that, because you're already going to get into some rendering issues, or certain graphics card might not render it properly, or things might not be like compile right. So I always stay below the 16. I find that using like I said, the RMA texture and kind of compressing your textures down to individual texture samples. I can bring one of those up to kind of show you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
What I'm talking about here. Let's see. So for instance, if I bring up, so you can see here, this is a hanging light material texture I have. This is an RMA texture. So what I've done is in the red channel is my roughness. So based on black being the most rough and white being like the most dirty, or like, or excuse me, black being the most smooth and white being the rough. And then my green channel is my metalness. So that's the parts that are metal. My blue channel is my ambient occlusion that I pack in.
Hey, Clinton, I'm sorry. It looks like a couple of people are having some, they're saying the audio was gone. Can you guys hear Clinton now?
Can you hear me now? Let's see.
We just get a yes. I just want to make sure you guys are able to hear Clinton. Mark and David. Okay, yeah, we're good.
Okay, so the blue channel is my ambient occlusion. This is usually either me baking it through, say, anything from like Mighty Bake or out of Maya or whatnot. And then lastly, I use my alpha for either emissive or just like literal alpha, or like masking or transparency. And that way I'm only using one texture call for this guy without having to have like a separate texture for each. So basically I can have basically all my one channel of like, say, my dirt within like 3 textures. So I have my normal, my albedo, and my my RMA texture, without having to have like a bunch of textures that I'm calling in. And that way I get a bit more flexibility to use more textures or use less. And then you can always like pack the fuse or the albedo channel with something in the alpha as well.
Cool. So all right. So next question here is from Constantine. What sources did you say you use for the environment details? Have you sculpted elements like footprints by hand, or there are some scans that you're using, which kind of ties into another question that a lot of people had, which is, have you used scanned data before?
Yeah, so I have worked with scan data a bit before. A guy I'm working with right now at work, Andrew, he's actually looking into it for working on gears and stuff like that. But we're not actually, most everything is done with just like tender loving care and just like hand sculpts. A lot of things I'll try to like take some photos for reference just to kind of make sure I get the general idea. Sometimes I'll extract from photos depending on how intense the neural map is going to be. But for the most time, it's just a lot of sculpts and ZBrush for like tiling textures. And then also using things like Nald and just like things like Dedo and Quixel. I've been using a lot of that as well.
Cool. And a couple of students had a question as to whether or not the decal spline setup is something that's going to be covered in your class.
I can definitely talk about that in my class. We'll be talking about splines and how to use those. We'll be having some like pipes and things like that that kind of run through the area that we're going to be developing. And so that's definitely something you'll be learning a bit about for sure.
Cool. And Jay's asking, would you continue to use those Vertex paints for your final optimal pass? And how does that affect performance?
Yeah, so Vertex paint, depending on how many layers you have, it's pretty cheap to get the Vertex paint in the object itself. It's just how many draw calls you have for texture or for the material that you're using on it. So as long as you keep your material cheaper or the size of the textures that you're calling, it's not that expensive. It's just those actual calls of the textures or the material instruction count.
Okay, cool. And and I don't know if you mentioned it, but what software are you using for modeling?
For modeling, I use.
Well, actually, kind of give us just a rundown of the different softwares you use. So let's create this scene.
Sure. Yeah. So for this scene, I used obviously a lot of ZBrush just because it's a lot more organic shapes compared to something like the laundromat or something I did. It's a bit more organic. So I use ZBrush, and then for the walls, the first time I went through it, I actually just used some Photoshop filters and things like that and used some Indu. The second time I went through, I had learned a bit from my lead at work, Malcolm. He had helped me out with learning about some of the stuff in Nald, and so I used that for some of the wall textures and like some of the rocky stuff using derivative maps. That was pretty cool. And then typically, I stay in Photoshop and Dedo for a lot of the assets and props. I find that Dedo, when I first started using it, was a bit slower, like in the old version, but the newer version, I haven't had any problems. So I really enjoy using Dedo to work on a lot of the props and assets. And then I'm trying to think if there's anything else I use. Oh, Mighty Bake, that's a newer one I've started using since working on gears. That's something we also use at work, which is really cool and powerful tool. It's super cheap to get to, and it's good for baking out MIKK neural maps and things like that. So yeah, cool. I think that's it.
Okay, great. And so speaking of software, Daniel is asking, do you use softwares like Substance Designer for ground textures? And obviously you mentioned that they were all sculpted by hand. But it seems like you're more familiar with Quixel.
Yeah, so I have messed around with Substance a bit. I definitely think there's like ideal uses for each, and also there's times when you could like weave in and out of all three, like Photoshop, Quixel or Substance. I don't think restricting or limiting yourself to any one particular software is the best way to go. I think like when we work on gears, we're pretty open to what we use. So I think that's what makes for the best artists, is because you're kind of just like testing to see what works in the best case scenario. And so Substance in this case would have probably been just as like pleasing of a result. I just ended up using more sculpts just for this scenario.
Cool. And how do you keep textile density uniform, or is it not uniform?
It depends on the project I've worked on. I think for the most part, you just kind of want to use like understanding of like your measurement sizes. So when you figure out your base texture size. So like a lot of these are 1024 or 2048, and then you figure out how big in the scene you want that to be, and you could simply bring a simple like a noise texture in or anything like that into your scene and kind of test in front of your character's perspective. Typically, when I make stuff for myself, I make it within like a third-person perspective, like kind of how like Gears is made, where you kind of see things from like a relatively medium to long distance. So your textual resolution doesn't have to be as high. If you're working on a first-person game, you definitely want to make sure you're keeping your textual resolution, especially things in front of the character, at a much higher resolution. And so I think just like bringing in those texture sheets, testing them, see how big they are. When you first bring in an asset, you bring in the normal map, just throwing like a checkerboard on it, just to be like, oh yeah, okay, this checkerboard is way too big compared to this other checkerboard asset that is like really small and dense. And it's like, maybe I can like either lessen the amount of density in the smaller object or up the resolution on the bigger asset.
Cool. So what you mentioned the resolution of the wall textures. What was that? Was that 1040 or?
The resolution on the rock textures.
Yeah, the wall textures.
Yeah. So they're 2048 for the main textures, and then the supporting textures like the macro, normal, and the detailing, they're anywhere from 512 to 1024.
Okay, cool. And any chance we could get a shader complexity view?
Sure.
Did you show us that already, or?
I don't. Not yet.
I think that was just the material.
Yes.
review.
So here's the light complexity. Let's see. Let me bring up. So you can see the fog is really where it's something like for everything I've made that I've really shown anyone or like given anyone for any project, I typically will put the fog in, at like a more of a cinematic level, and then I make it. I put a switch in there so that we can turn it down so that it's not as intense or not as intensive or labor intensive for the machine to handle. And so you can see these are just like a lot of like fog planes and things like that are costing the most, but for the most part, everything else is relatively cheaper.
Cool. All right. So I know Wesley's saying, I know you mentioned this earlier, but if you could perhaps talk a little bit about your lighting process.
Sure. Yeah. So I think a better one to talk about lighting would probably be the laundromat I worked on. This one was a bit more of a big learning experience for me for like lighting properly. And so when you have like bigger spaces like the cave, it's a lot easier to kind of throw a point light or a spotlight, and you get really what you want. And you don't have to worry about too many lights overlapping, and you can use stationary lights, and you can get like that nice gleam on the edges of things, and it's not as intense. But when you're working in like smaller rooms, such as the laundromat, you kind of have to really kind of figure out how you're going to balance the certain light of different things to each other. And so I typically will, like I said, I'll have the kind of room lit out, like blocked out and lit pretty quickly from the beginning. And from there, it's really, really start establishing like how intense and bright my lights are, how much lighting information I need to have on certain aspects. And even in like dark rooms like this, I wanted to make sure that you didn't run into the scenario where it's like, oh, it's kind of horror feeling, it's kind of like scary, but you still want it to always be visible, because like there's nothing worse than like making this grand piece, this huge thing, and then like not being able to actually see anything because you want it to be so dark and like hard to, like really kind of eerie. So like just kind of finding that the balance of like light and dark values, and just like testing with usually with stationary first, and then if I can't afford the stationary, I'll switch back to just like a simple light, and then very once in a while I'll use a movable light or like a flicker or something like that.
Such a beautiful scene, man.
Oh, thank you very much.
It's amazing. It's like, kind of, you're obviously just a great all around artist, kind of going from, the more organic, rocky type of formations, to, something more, manufactured and handmade and, man-made. So it's definitely a testament to your ability as an artist to kind of go between the two different styles.
Yeah, thank you.
The two different aesthetics. So do you use multiple UV channels for differentiated details? Jay is asking.
Yes, depending on the asset. So for instance, like these guys here, I was like, okay, I want to make this this thing light up with a number on top. But I was like, man, I don't want to use a whole 2048 by 2048 texture just for the 125. I was like, man, that would be super wasteful. So like for instance, this guy, I would use a second UV channel, and I would actually just have the material on that second UV channel, so that I wouldn't have to like incur a whole new draw call just for a whole new material. I would just have a second UV channel with another quick like emissive channel built into that.
Okay.
And I would do that for other things as well too. So like depending on like what kind of asset I'm making, like if it needs more love in one area, or like the light map resolution I want to be better in the front and the back, I always do like a separate UV channel or whatever I need to do.
Cool. I'm just paying attention to all the details as you kind of going through there. And it's so how long did the scene take you to put together?
This one was also about 2.5 months. This was
Okay.
just more of a project I wanted to do on my own. And the kind of thing I really liked about working on this project is this is a project I started way back in college. I did it the first time. It was pretty god awful the first time, uh, because I was like just learning. I just started it's something I wanted to do, just like a really kind of like mundane scene, and just like really make it kind of eerie. And then I a couple years later I did it again, and I tried it again, and I definitely could see where I had grown and like learned a lot, but like I was still like, I'm still not quite happy with it. I still want to learn more. And so I waited to this last year, and I was like, oh yeah, it'd be really fun to take another crack at the laundromat. So I just went back through and just kind of redid all the assets and the materials and stuff like that, and just like basically built it from the ground up again. And like it was just really fun to kind of see all the kind of like growth I'd made over the years. And it just kind of like reinforces like, oh yeah, you are learning. You're constantly kind of like learning new aspects of the engine, or like new ways to go about making things.
No, spectacular job, man. So, and, and I'm going to butcher this name, is asking, how do you keep yourself motivated for long projects like this?
Sure. So I think that's definitely a hard thing to do. And so I think a couple tools I use, like I said, I use the Trello boards. Those are really helpful to kind of making sure, like, because sometimes you'll start a project and you don't really have it like down on paper of what you're trying to have at the final. And so by breaking down the whole project into like, all right, these are the 30 assets I'm going to make, and then here's the like 10 secondary assets. If I don't feel worn out by the time I get to these secondary assets, I'll make these too. So you kind of have like a stepping stone for yourself to like, oh, you feel like you've kind of made it through like gates within your project. So it's like, oh, I did all the primary assets, and now I'm like just working on lighting, or I'm working on this part. And it's like, by kind of like showing yourself that you are getting closer to the finish line and having a visible finish line, I feel like that's really important to like artists, because like artists will see something and they'll be like, oh, I really want to make this like underground dungeon with a dragon and like this crazy stuff, and then they'll start on it, and then like 10 weeks later it's like, oh, I overscoped this project so much, like it's such a big thing, it's like I don't even want to feel like working on it anymore, and then you just get like burnt out really quick. So I think just like making sure that you've kind of like box it up for yourself as like a package. Like, here's what I want to complete at the end. I just need to take out a little bit by a little bit at a time, and then I have an end goal that it's definitely in mind.
That's such a smart way of working. And I know that was one of the things that you mentioned regarding your class, that you wanted to create a vignette or create a scene that was very manageable and obtainable in terms of, making sure that students had a great piece for their demo reel, at the end of the class. So, so I didn't know you used Trello for some of that. So it's going to be, it's going to be interesting, to see how that's incorporated in the class. Is that something that you're going to be covering as well? Just like a brief overview of just, how to plan out, your assets, your scene, and be organized.
Yeah, definitely. So I like I said, I love Trello. It's super useful. It's like free. It's like a great artist tool. And it's like, I don't even know if they planned it that way when they first started, but it's like, because you can just throw a quick image up. I can even like bring up something to kind of example of.
Oh
like,
yeah, that would be great.
Let me bring up something here. Let's see. So I'll be talking about it definitely in the class. I'll give a brief overview of how I use it. I'll probably actually go through and just like show how I was making things for how I was doing things. So like, here's an example of like a really quick thing. So you can see here, like these are the textures that I wanted to create. Here's some references of other people's or mine, or anything that I found online that I was like, okay, I really like these flags. So like I just threw a quick image up, and then now I have these references all in one place that I can come back to at any point and be like, oh, so I was working on this, but I can't remember what that was like sort of like. So like just gathering references and having constant like things to look at and be like, oh yeah, this is what I want this to end up looking like. Or even like bug fixing, like, oh, you see a bug when you're working, but you don't want to stop middle of what you're doing. So you just throw it on the Trello board, and then you come back to your bugs at the end of the project and be like, all right, here's the bugs I need to work through to kind of get through.
Cool. And is this, are you using Quixel for this scene as well?
Yeah, so Quixel was this was when I went primarily mostly, I would say like 80 to 90% Quixel of just like really understanding I kind of really understood the pipeline after I worked on the bunker for the first time of like how to get an asset. Like I could take an asset by the morning, and then by the end of the evening or like in the afternoon, depending on the size of the asset, I've got like all the edge wear I wanted, all like the paint wear and everything like that I clearly wanted, and then get it in the engine. And then it's like super quick to just do really quick iterations on. And it's like, oh, I don't quite like how this looks. And then I'll have a master material in my scene, and that master material will have like controls like for roughness or things like that. So like I'll even bring up one of these guys and show you. Let's see. So if I bring up, let's see. Let me ungroup this. So for this top washer here, you can see the number on top because of the second UV channel that I talked about before for that second thing. But I have it, so basically all my controls I try to put into my master material, and then I make them parameters. So like I can change like the emulsion misapplier, I can change like how much of the light mask replacement I have, so like what kind of color is projected from it and shows in the GI bake. I can have my normal intensity, my like kind of like color balancing, my roughness, and so that way it's like it provides you with like the quickest way to like get your stuff in engine after you think it looks good. And even if you're like, oh, it's like this is not quite rough enough, you don't have to go back to the start and go all the way back to Photoshop. You just do a couple quick changes in here to get like what you like and like where your roughness to be or where your metallic to be. And I find that just provides for like the quickest way to like continuously iterate on your scene and get like through the, each aspect of it as fast as you can with having the maximum amount of quality as well.
Cool. So speaking of quality, Vince, is wanting to know how many hours per week would students need to dedicate for your class?
I think it depends on like really what you want in the class. I mean, I think it's just one of those things as you, it depends on your skill level. So like say, for instance, someone that's never used Quixel before, they might need an extra like 5 to like 8 hours, just learning like the basic, kind of like, here's what I need to know. Here's how these kind of different masks work. I think it just depends on like the learning set that you already possess. And then also like, how much more do you want to know? Like you could always do like the basic bare minimum of being like, oh, I just want to make this wall look like basic metal. It's like, or you can really take that extra time, maybe like take another 30 minutes to an hour and really further develop that like material so that it's like what we were talking about earlier with like keeping it kind of a smaller scene but more concise, is because I really just want students to be able to like look at the scene and be like, all right, well, I messed with this metal once before, and now that I have time and I've got most of the scene constructed, I can really just like hone down and like get into those like nooks and crannies of the scene and really like make a really ideal project comparatively to something that's maybe a bit more bland and grandiose that you didn't really have as much time to develop each aspect of it. So just like paying attention to those little like individual bits and like really take into the nitty gritty details.
Cool. And for a non-tech demo scene, how do you go about balancing artistic quality with performance?
I think it's just gauging it based on, I guess, like player visibility and how much of the asset the player's going to see, how big a wall is, how big, any kind of thing. You just kind of have to gauge on like, what is the importance that this thing that you're making plays within the scene? If it's a pencil on the ground underneath of an asset, you probably don't need, you need little to no texture space to make something of that size. And also a really light, light map resolution and just not too much time developed into that. And so like kind of gauging, and that's what a blockout is really good for, and like using that kind of like initial step, because it's like, oh, okay, well, this wall is going to be huge and there's a lot of like empty space, so I really need to spend some more time in texture resolution to make this look good. But also just keeping in mind, okay, well, the player is third person, so they're never going to get but so close. So maybe like keeping it to a 1024 over a 2048 or even like a 4K, it's like that might not be necessary because you're never going to get that close and you're never going to need that texture resolution, and you might be able to use that somewhere else to make sure you get good production value.
Cool. And Jason is asking, would a student be fine using Substance Painter instead of Quixel?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll be teaching Quixel within the class, but it's not to say that the type of style of wear and tear and construction that I'll be creating in the class is not limited to Quixel, Photoshop, or Substance. It's really just like understanding of how to kind of integrate that wear and how to integrate the believability of material kind of breakdown. So like if a plastic's been old or it's like been scratched a bunch, it's like you don't need any one program to tell you that. You just need you as an artist to look at this and be like, I need to establish how old this plastic is, what kind of use it's had, and how it's been worn. And it doesn't matter what program you use for that.
Okay, cool. And Jessica's wanting to know, what are some of the parameters you find yourself tweaking the most?
Like this. Definitely roughness and smoothness, because you'll get a lot of times where you really want like a hot glint on something. So like you can see here, you get like these nice kind of like glints on the ground and like from like the water that's kind of being cast on the ground. And so like these kind of areas right here are really what sells, I find, in like the newer kind of production value. Really what sells the believability of the scene, because there's so many times that you'll see in like older gen games where there's no real material response or like any kind of specular or anything like that, because that either that texture was cut, never made, or it just wasn't like enough room to make that. And now that we've kind of like come into the next era of gaming, you have a bit more resolution and a bit more ability to control how much of a roll off is on those aspects of the different parts you make of the game. So just kind of like really tweaking that in the end will really help to make and sell like the best looking kind of like production value.
Cool. And since we're in that little area with the water on the tile, sure. Jessica is asking, how do you go about creating that?
So this was, yeah, sure. So this was, again, is another Vertex thing. I can show you with a Vertex thing here. I think I have. So like you can see, it comes in and out.
Oh, dude.
So it's, and then I broke this down into a few parts. Let me get my brush a little smaller here. So this one was this first one I have is like more of like a crack map. So it's like more of like these guys got chipped or damaged or whatnot. And then that's just basically, I made the same texture. I just duplicated it and then worked some cracks into it and did some wear and a bit more dirt onto it. And then some of the other channels I have is like the green channel. It's just like kind of some dirt, some like wear, where I can put underneath of like some of the objects to get some more wear and tear on it. And then lastly, the blue channel I put on top because that's like the water. So you'll always get that accumulating on top of everything. So whereas this guy, you kind of have it so it overlays on top, and then it based off of the height map of the tile. So it'll always try to collect in the kind of edges and cracks first before it fills up the top.
Oh, that is so cool, man.
Thank you.
It's Unreal is something I haven't used before. And yeah, Adam is right. You're a wizard when it comes to this stuff. So.
Yeah, definitely. I think without Vertex painting, it would be a lot harder to create a lot of the variation that you get in Unreal. And I think that's just definitely one of the most powerful and parts I like the best about Unreal, because it's like you really get to like refine those areas of details without having to like make a whole unique map for something just because you want a bit more dirt down here or a bit more water here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, it makes complete sense. And are you using a unique light map UVs for each mesh, or UDK automatic?
So for most of them, I bring them in automatic. It's only if I have an error generated from the bake that I will do a light map. Or if, say, for instance, like it's something really big and I only need the front to be shown, but I want like just a enclosed model just for some reason, then I would probably light map the front a bit bigger and then kind of make this back a bit smaller. But that's a very rare scenario. For the most time, 99% of the time, I bring an asset in, as long as it's UV'd well in your first, your actual like map that you're using for your textures, then 9 times out of 10 it'll come in no problems, and Unreal will kind of figure it out. It's only when you get like overlapping or like things that are like loops that you might get an issue or two, and it's usually a quick fix of like 5 minutes, bringing it back into Maya, doing an extra light thing, and just bringing it back in.
Cool. And the questions keep piling on. But so let's talk a little bit about, the class. So what should a student expect to get out of it? Like, give us a little overview of what a student should expect to get from this class.
Sure. So I think the biggest things that, in talking to you and just like kind of like thinking about really what things I kind of wish I'd have known, like going into the industry or like making my first scene or even second scene. It's I think like a feeling of completion and like getting something that you're really proud of in the end. That's kind of like it's a bit smaller of a kind of diorama, like you were saying, something sort of like the laundromat, where it's like a contained space that you can kind of like walk around just a little bit in. But it's more of just like, all right, I have this space, I know how far my bounds are, and then by the end of the project, you'll learn how to like make the modular aspects of it. You'll know how to make the walls. You'll understand how to make like the measurements of things and how they relate to real world space. And then also you'll get some like a little bit more education about like learning about the Vertex shaders, some spline stuff, using some emissive things, working on like master materials. So I'd say like 90% of the assets in the scene use one master material. And that makes it so much easier for me to control everything else in the scene, and then just have instances. And you'll learn about a lot about that and just kind of how you can save some time for your own production value, so that if you go off after this project and you make another scene, besides the already awesome scene that you'll get from this, you'll kind of have the understanding. It's like, oh, I know how to do this 3 times faster than I did before. I can really just like whip through this next project and really just get some block-ins down, and then I can quickly understand composition. I kind of understand color of where I'm going, and then before you even know it, like you've already got pretty much the core values of your scene laid out without even actually making an asset yet. And so that saves you a bunch of time and just like understanding good work practices and pipeline workflows.
Cool. And guys, I have the link to the class, as a sticky, so definitely feel free to click on that. Anthony is saying he's thinking of canceling his vacation to take this class, or making this class his vacation. So either way, I don't think you could lose Armando or Anthony. Sorry about that. So Jessica, actually no, it's not Jessica, it's Amy. Can someone with a full-time job keep up with this class?
Yes, you definitely can. I think it's just something, like I said, it's all about your investment. And so when I was creating all these scenes, none of these scenes was not created at the same time I had a full-time job. So every single one of these scenes was done in my off time, and I still was like going to the park, still doing things with my partner, still taking my dog out. Like I didn't have to like wreck my full-time life to just do these scenes. So I think the class I'm trying to keep it contained enough for people like Jessica was saying, something where it's something you can keep it to a point where it's not so massive that you can't control it, and by the end you'll still have something really awesome that you're proud to call your own, that you've only spent 10 weeks of really just putting work into in the off time.
Cool, great. And what is the one thing you'll say you would say to all aspiring environment artists?
I would say, I'd probably say don't stop learning. Like never stop being like, I know sometimes the people, when they start getting in the industry, they'll have their first job and they'll like sit down and be like, oh yeah, I made it, got my first job. I'm not going to learn anything else at home. I'm just going to do what I need to do here. And it's like, that's the worst. Like, don't quit there. Like, keep going, keep learning, keep growing as an artist, and keep growing as just like a human being, because like, you'll find that like, you'll find places in your life that are easy to kind of like stall out and just kind of like do what you're doing like on a day-to-day, and you'll find that you'll kind of lose some creativity. You won't feel as energized or is invigorated by the work you're doing sometimes. And so having like a side project that like throughout most of the things I've worked on, I'll work on like something realistic at work, and then at home I'll work on something kind of stylized, and then like at work I'm something realistic or like a vehicle, and at home I'll be working on something completely different, just to kind of like mix it up and keep you like creatively invigorated.
Cool, definitely. All right. So what is and to that point, what is the most important thing you've learned that have helped you to become a better environment artist?
I would say there's 1,000 ways to do any one task. It could be, ZBrush, Maya, like any kind of tool that you have, as long as you have it, don't be afraid to use it or try a different way of going about it. Because like, you like may think, oh, I want to model this organic thing, but it might take me this long to do in this program. And it's like, oh, well, if I maybe just spent like an hour learning how to do it in like, say, ZBrush or something, I might be able to make this spline or this organic thing way quicker in ZBrush just by spending a little time to like learn and sit down and just be like, maybe I'll try it a different way than I would have normally. And so like, don't be afraid to like just test something else. And I feel like that's always kept me kind of like motivated to learn something new. And I feel like that's just going to kind of be the trend, because you're always going to have new tech, new things that are coming out.
Cool. And for this scene, are you using real world scale?
Yeah, everything in this scene was scaled exactly to real world. So me and my partner always helps me with this, and I'm always thankful to have Amanda help me with that. But she sat down with me one night, and I was like, "Here's all the assets I want to make," and she doesn't do 3D or anything at all, but she was like, "Sure, I'll help you with whatever you need." And we just went through and we like got the exact measurements off like Amazon or wherever, just to find like, all right, this is how big a washing machine is. This is how big a mat is. This is how big as this is. Because you'll find that if you don't understand those real world contexts when you first start a project, you'll get in some really weird murky water really quick when you're like, you'll have like a bottle that's like the size of someone's head, or like, like a piece of trash that's like so small it's like you have to scale it by 100 for it to even work in the scene. And it just makes it for a lot harder to control later on when you're like trying to move things around or you want to reorganize something, just to try to get that real world space right away and just understanding real world measurements.
Cool. And there's a laundry basket in the scene with holes in it. Was that a alpha map or is that model?
So I had made it originally with an alpha map, and then at the end of the project, I didn't like how it was doing some dithering issues. And so, say for instance, for a game, you would probably want to do something like this for like a real production value. You would probably want to do something like this with an alpha that had like a thicker edge. But I really wanted to get that kind of like thin, kind of like spindly look to it for the the metal. So I ended up just making it's just basic cubes, and then I just smoothed or I soft edged all the edges, and then just had a little teeny bevel on the edge to wrap around the sides here.
Okay, cool. I'm sorry, there's it's trash day today, and there's this guy outside. Just seems like he's destroying all the trash can out there. So it's a little annoying. So Amy is asking, how is this class going to be structured? Is it a lecture every day of the week, or one lecture a few hours long, an assignment per week?
It'll be one every week. You'll have a class that you can kind of like listen to and kind of like go through, and I'll kind of break it into like things that you kind of need to know at this part of the pipeline production process. So like for the first class of me, I'll talk about like references. I'll talk about like ways you can kind of organize your thoughts. I'll talk about like some of the story elements that we're going to talk about, just kind of like figuring out your scene and kind of doing like some quick like base mesh modeling. And then each class will be every week. It'll be for 10 weeks straight. And then each class will kind of give you something by the end to like, all right, here's something you should kind of work on and develop to get yourself up to the next class. So that way, when the next class comes, you're basically where you need to start off, and like you can listen to that class, go through like the entire lecture and kind of understand all the parts of that, and then be like, okay, now I understand these new tools that I can now integrate back into the project I was making to continue on to the next class, and that'll go for 10 weeks straight. And I think on the classroom, the elective that you have posted at the top, that has like a breakdown of what each class entails.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
you guys can go there for more detail and email us if you have more questions as it relates to the class. We're running a little short on time here, but wanted to get into a little bit of VR. And I know there's another scene that you had that you mentioned. Some people have actually tried using, have actually tried experiencing it with the Oculus as well as the Vive headset. And so the question is VR going to change the workflow in terms of meeting frame rates?
I definitely would agree, because when I first started this project, I had developed it with like a pretty low poly count in mind and kind of keeping the texture sizes relatively small. And then as I'm working on it, I kind of like, I want to increase this a little bit or do this or change this. And I found that you kind of quickly will lose that frame rate if you're not really careful. So like VR definitely influences like, okay, I need to make sure these resolutions stay below this size. I need to keep constantly testing to see how fast it is in engine, like do some performance testing. Unreal has a bunch of tools that has like some things to like test to see how well things are functioning, what takes up the most space, how long each texture takes to bring into memory. And then you kind of just like re-examine that throughout the process, say like, oh, maybe this doesn't need to be like 1024, maybe it can be a 512 or even 256 if it's like really small. And so just like kind of keeping that in mind. And I've had a few people said they've purchased this scene from me and they've used it for VR testing and they said it worked really well. And then I've also, like, as I've continued to update it, I have to keep that in mind that certain people are using this for certain aspects that you might not have originally intended it for. So like just knowing your audience and what you're trying to create your project for. And so like with knowing that your project's going to be going into VR, you have to constantly keep that in mind throughout the production for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And So what's the frame rate of the scene in VR? Is it something you've experienced, as well, or?
No, the frame rate so far, I don't know the exact number, but I know that through testing, I worked with another a partner of mine who did some testing in it. He said he was like testing on a regular basis and telling me, giving me feedback. They're like, all right, when you did the fog, this was getting pretty heavy and this was getting a little clunky. Can we do this? And he gave me a lot of really good feedback. And then I kind of worked with that to kind of like continue like push out builds to him to test. And so by the end, he'd like send me a copy to use, and I used it with just like a really quick like the Google like the cardboard thing, and it worked like really well just to like look around and see the scene, and then like he sent me a video of him walking around and like picking up objects and like throwing a telephone around and doing stuff, and it works super smooth after just a few iterations.
Great. And how much knowledge of Unreal do you think someone needs to know before going into this class?
I'm going to try to like make sure I keep it to a pretty basic level for the most part. There'll be a few things that I would say that if you maybe took like a day or two, just like an afternoon, and kind of like really got to know like some of the just the basic tools like selection, moving, just like rotations, things like that, just kind of general like ways to go about like manipulating things in the scene. I'll be talking about how to import things, how to get textures in, what kind of compression settings to use on your textures, everything like of that nature. So don't have to worry about that stuff. It's just mostly just being able to just like move around the scene and understanding like the manipulation controls.
Cool. So, all right, just going through all of these questions. How do you deal with shadows versus performance?
So yeah, like I said, with this scene, we did some testing with the VR stuff. So I would kind of set the resolution. Okay, I want this object to be 64 light map resolution, or we even tried movable lights at first, and I found that the backlighting ended up being the best cost wise and look wise for the kind of trade off. So I ended up using that, and I ended up using bounce lighting with this, and so. With that, I just kind of like tested a few of the assets. I tested it within like a different like lighting test scene to be like, okay, if I render this at a 64 light map, or if I render it at an 80 light map, or I render it at 120, like does it really make a difference on like the value at the end? And then I would kind of like review those and be like, oh, this looks good. I don't really need that much light map on this, or maybe like, oh, this is looking a little sketch, or like this might not work well. So like for instance, like things like the desk here, I was like, oh, I kind of have to have a higher light map resolution because the glancing angle of the sun is coming pretty like acute to the desk. So you kind of need like softer shadows coming back. Whereas like maybe something like out here in the corner, like this trash can, I don't need anywhere close to as much because it's kind of in the back. It's getting a direct light, and you don't really need high resolution.
Great. And Darren, to answer your question, you can use any software you're comfortable with. Darren was asking whether or not he needs Maya, or he could use different applications like Modo. So.
For sure, yeah, and I'll be talking primarily about like how I'm going about importing into Maya, but you can use anything as long as you're comfortable with understanding how to like get that imported into the engine. And typically, just by using an FBX, it's like that. It's super easy to get anything into the engine.
Yep, definitely. And so since we're talking about just work as an environment artist, we're talking about class. Let's talk a little bit about portfolios. What elements would you say are crucial to display in a portfolio for an inspiring environment artist?
I would say for any environment artist, I'd say the number one thing I pay attention to is like someone that's like reviewing someone's portfolio or whatnot. I would say, are they a completionist and can they get things done? And then what is the quality of their kind of like attention to detail? Those are like the two things that you can typically tell if someone is like a really good artist, or like more of like someone that's like still learning or might not be up to the par of like a professional like environment artist. So like completionism, that's like talking about like did they create a scene? Did they seem like they finished it to the point where it's a shippable level? Did they really like is there like gray blocks still left from the scene? Did they seem like they really like basically like closed out the level? Did it seem like they sort of half started? Like, I don't mind sometimes seeing work in progress, but it should definitely be labeled work in progress unless you're done with it. And if you're done with it, please show that you're really done with it. Like, don't be like, oh, it's sort of done, I'm gonna like work on it later, and then kind of have that in the comments, because it's like that kind of turns you off from like most artists, because it makes you think, oh, they might not be able to get everything done in a timely manner. And that's really important with the industry, because like everything's on a timeline. You kind of have like this much time to get something done. And so like knowing that someone can get something in and out and done with no issue is a really important trait. And then the attention to details of saying like, did they look like they like kind of investigated each part of their scene and like really like narrowed it down to like, oh, this is the kind of style I'm going for, and like were they able to capture that and like talk about like why they were doing what they're doing, and understanding like, oh, I just didn't like make this, but like I did it because this is exactly what I was trying to head for. This is the color palette I was trying to use.
Cool. What advice would you have for a student trying to get in, into a AAA game, studio as an environment artist?
I would say diligence, and make sure you understand all the avenues that you should be taking. So like when I first was trying to find a job, it's obviously tough for anyone trying to break into the industry for the first time. So like I think just like making sure that you have a good online presence. So like I constantly update my LinkedIn, my portfolio, my resume, like making sure that you look like a solid character, not only through your work, but also through your like just diligence to like get your name out there and like spread the word that you're looking for work, or you're trying to get in the industry, and like here's some really cool work that you did and things like that. Like people love like sharing stuff, and I love seeing other people's work. It's like that's what makes places like Polycount and like stuff like that really powerful, because like people are constantly showing work and then like driving off each other to like creative influence. And so like LinkedIn's a huge one for looking for work. That's a really big one. And then like Polycount, I actually found my first job through a forum in Polycount. So like just make sure when you're investigating that, you're like when you're talking to people that you're getting like full details on the job. But that's like a really good like place to find either contract work or full-time positions for sure.
Definitely. And if you could take us back to that scene, we're going to probably just, leave off with that. And this is just for me personally, because I'm just obsessed with the scene. Yeah, that's pretty badass.
Thank you very much.
That is something else, man. Could you rotate around a little bit?
Sure, yeah.
So you're saying all these scenes are available on your website? Not this one.
Yeah, all these scenes are available on my website. I've made them. This one actually was was made in, like I said, collaboration with Collide Entertainment, and they just recently allowed me to have this for purchase on my website. And so all three the scenes I showed today are available on there, and they also have some breakdowns. So even if you're not interested in purchasing or whatnot, you can still see the breakdown sheets of like, here's what I did in the scene, here's some kind of ideology, and also that 80 level is like really intensive like explanation of what I did with the laundromat.
Oh, something else. Absolutely amazing. Well, Clinton, we're pressed for time. I know you got to get back to work.
For sure.
It's amazing that they actually allowed you to, take the time to talk to us. So thank them on our behalf.
For sure.
Once again, absolutely amazing work. And you're obviously very knowledgeable about what you do and very passionate. And it's always great to have that. So yes, Paul, I do have a man crush. All right. It's something else. So, cool. Well, and everybody, thank you so much for taking time off of your lunch, night, morning, wherever you're at in the world, to join us. Thank you so much. We're actually going to be doing, for the next 2 to 3 weeks, we're going to be doing more environment focused, live sessions. We're really ramping up, the environment aspect of the classes. That's something that, a lot of you guys have mentioned that you're interested in. So we're going to be really doubling down on that. But once again, Clinton, thank you so much. Such talent, great work.